Chapter 2. School Days. Elmhurst Primary School, Upton Park Road, Forest Gate, London was my start, and without question the most impressionable of my schooling years. Nothing but good memories. And it couldn't have been more of a perfect setting. It was close to home, which Mum loved, as it was less than a 10-minute walk from our house. I would be able to get there with little effort to and from any place where a ball was being kicked about, and the streets that surrounded my small world back then were as much a devil's playground, but to me were an outlet that promoted a life for a young East London kid whose adventures and Peter Pan mindset were limitless. The housing, buildings, and I guess you could say face value of life back then was one of basic tones and colours, but what brought it all to life were the kids playing out and on every street, and not those just around your immediate home, but on the way to and from school. Life back then, and my early school years, was one that was promoted by the people that came in and out of your day, outside your front door, and my primary school, that by many standards was like a second home, a toy shop with teachers. I saw primary school as a place to go, learn, meet and spend time with mates, and more than anything for me to play football. It may be as much a surprise to some as it will be a disappointment to equally as many others, but I was very well placed at school. I really enjoyed all the subjects, did well with my exams, the results and what I achieved. I always got on well with the teachers, who would never have a bad word to say about me, as I enjoyed my time in the classroom and what I gained from being in there. I always understood and accepted what was expected of me. I remember primary school for learning and appreciating the social aspect of making new friends, ones that didn't necessarily live in the same street as you. Learning your first swear words and what boundaries could be pushed with your boyhood cheekiness towards both teachers and your parents. But there was never any level of spitefulness or malice. Definitely a time and place of boys will be boys. But again, there was a certain level of innocence in your humour, actions and behaviour. No matter what lesson existed, I always looked for any opportunity to kick a football about in the playground, or a flat open space, before, during and after school. And that, football, was anything that we deemed was kickable, and God help anyone if the existence of an actual football was missing, because if you dropped anything that we felt that could be kicked, dribbled, and then put between two jumpers, markings, or anything that somewhat resembled goalposts, then you'd have to wait for either a goal to be scored or a teacher to come along and retrieve what you were once in possession of. It was also a time that your injuries, falls, cuts and scrapes were as much part and parcel of your childhood as the method and cause. My mum would joke, if I was climbing a tree it would be on the branch that'd always break, and no matter how small a piece of broken glass was on the ground, he'd land on it. The warm summers and riding of bikes, the climbing of trees in your mum and dad's back garden and the snow-filled winters. A childhood that seemed to be consumed with laughs and dares that you found in any one of the months that filled the year, and it was during these years and your primary school days that the times, places and adventures that you shared with the same playground mates you honestly thought you'd be hanging about with forever. I'm not in touch with a single fucking one now. If your parents wanted to place you in what was called a grammar school, a higher level of discipline, concentration on academic achievements and a very strict school uniform, then you had to sit an exam during your last year of primary school that would determine if you met a certain learning or academic standard. I'd have to check into it, but I don't think they even make kids sit that exam anymore. So, to say I was gutted when I sat, scored very highly on my 11+ exam, then being told I would be attending a grammar school away from all of my primary school mates, is an understatement. For the best part, all of my mates were being sent to Sandringham Secondary School, where Tony Tucker went, and I've thought at least once, if not twice, how my life might have turned out if I'd met up with him back then, as I honestly think the meet would have been inevitable. Birds of a feather and all that. Mum couldn't have been any prouder. Her little boy had earned his place at the best school in Newham Borough. Dad had decided that I was going to Stratford Grammar without question, as he'd already planned, that after finishing school and gotten my O-levels, I was going to be getting an apprenticeship at the docks. I knew it was a lost cause and would be impossible to argue with a man who left school at 14 and went into the Merchant Navy, or a mum whose education was that of an all-girls Catholic school, whose administration and teachers were all nuns, and of a post-Victorian discipline and mindset. In their eyes, I was being given an opportunity that they'd only dreamt of as kids, and it wasn't going to be passed up. The first step was opening day. Mum came along and was still over the moon, But no sooner as we'd left from seeing what everything was and I didn't want to be part of in any way, I found myself attending my first day at a place that I wish didn't exist. Grammar school was a step in my young life I think I could never have been prepared enough for, and if I'm honest, for the first year I never liked it at any stage, as one bad day at primary school, for the best part, was better than any day of the first year of my grammar school life. My first thought and question when walking towards and then through those gates for the first time was, what the fuck have I done to deserve this? I noticed a lot of kids about my age were all bunching together and walking towards a yet unseen, unmarked finish line. With our socks pulled up and ties worn correctly covering the top button, our fresh, innocent faces and wide-eyed expressions couldn't have made us look like we stood out any more than we already did. We were easy to spot, and being very self-conscious with my new school uniform, I felt like easy prey. What seemed like a swirl of predators circling around the outside of our group were the returning students and years above us, who themselves had been through this same start and ritual in previous years. You could easily tell them apart from the new kids, loosened top buttons, and ties not as straight, their bags being carried in a less military fashion and more relaxed way. I didn't even want to trade places with them, I just wanted out of here. It was as daunting as it was humbling. A reminder I had no real pals and no one to lean on. It was as if I was in a foreign land, and even amongst a mass of people I felt totally defenseless and exposed, a feeling of emptiness and realization of isolation. I believed I'd had a better chance of survival if I'd been washed up on a desert island. Very quickly and without any warning, I discovered my fun-filled primary school days were fast becoming nothing more than a distant memory, and it was this shithole that was committing an unforgivable crime, one based on hate and empty promises. A place I loved going to had now been replaced by a prison and a sentence, disguised as a new school with years of forced attendance. What was once a carefree life with mates and cheerful-faced schoolteachers was now substituted by students in penguin-looking outfits, with a badge on a breast pocket, acting like miserable old men in young men's bodies. The teachers must have been at least 9 tall, appeared as black-cloaked, menacing, unemotional ghosts, here to suck the life and your memories out of you, then sending you home, a hollowed-out version of a boy who once had a soul. Even going to the toilets had you thinking if the stories were true of these man-sized children jumping out and beating you up. I found myself standing in the corridors, thinking if I was in the right spot or someone else's. If it wasn't one thing, it was another. When the teacher said, "The lesson is beginning," I actually heard, "Your life is now ending." Even morning assembly was a cold experience. Some might think a huge collection of kids in one area would promote and give a sense of unity and strength in numbers. Like fuck did it. Just another heartless and emotionless hole that reminded me where I didn't want to be. I absolutely hated the place. And the cherry on the cake, and something that couldn't have been any worse in terms of timing, was me having to wear glasses. Both Mum and Dad grafted, and whatever we had was as a result of their hard work. But anything extra meant it was at the government's expense. So, when I needed and had to wear glasses, I was kitted out with what was on offer, the hard-to-miss and all-too-classic NHS's thick-rimmed glasses, and just the sight of them being worn made most think I was trying to emulate the puppet character, Brains, off the TV show Thunderbirds. The fucking stick I got as a result of wearing them things. I tried everything to get rid of being seen in them. I'd break them, hoping for an upgrade, something more modern and not so fucking clumsy looking. But my dad would find ways of fixing them. The next move would be keeping them hidden in my school bag, so as not to have to wear them. But then I couldn't see fuck all or what was on the blackboard, so I'd end up sitting at the front of the class and spending the whole lesson squinting so I could see what was being written. An absolute nightmare. All I know is what worked for Michael Caine didn't work for me. But, as luck would have it, I learned one of my pals had an older brother that went to the school and was in the 4th year. Jimmy Colkit. He had some pull and presence, was a good-looking bloke and was a bit of a chap. You could always tell where he was in the playground. There was always a buzz and a lot of people around him. He had a certain energy that people wanted to be part of, and he must have had something else, as he always had girls hanging off of him. So, no sooner as I learned I had a chance of improving my existence and life, I befriended him, and that, thank fuck, started to turn things around for me. Sports was, I thought, going to be something I could disappear into and keep myself busy with. But again, as a testament to how much my start at the school was an unwelcomed one, the PE teacher was Welsh, so you guessed it. His love and obsession was for a sport that had an oddly shaped ball and whose rules were totally backwards. and if that wasn't bad luck enough, the other sport on the menu was basketball. Both never really fit, and as much as I tried kicking that fucking misshaped ball and with the grabbing and hugging of other boys, I just wasn't having it. But when the opportunity came along, I got into the football and on the school team. The first year was like living in Groundhog Day. Each day seemed to repeat itself. There was absolutely nothing that would make my existence or experience anything worth talking about, or special. My life and the days there were simply dull and mundane. But being I'd now started going to football regularly with my dad, if there was any chance of a conversation on football, or if someone supported West Ham, that then helped me make a couple of friends at school. It wasn't until the second year of school that I started to find both myself and my footing. This allowed me the benefit to form a small crowd of mates. There was a field right opposite the school called West Ham Park, a good place for kicking a ball and meeting up with some of the mates that I'd now made over the last year or so. Up the road was another school called St Bonaventure's, known informally as St Bon's on the Bolinard. It was an all-boys Catholic school, which meant they had twice the number of boys in their ranks as us, simply further translated that they had a decent number of lads that could have a fight. Now, being that we were a school whose strength was measured by kids who were more accustomed to fighting their way through equations and higher math problems than having it out on the cobbles, meant we had at most 1 out of 20 kids that could or were willing to have a fight, but St Bon's didn't have such a problem or concern, as they had about 15 out of 20 that could have a row. So much like all neighbouring schools, there was always talk, or a chance of a fight between them and us, but I'll come back to this later. It was during this time, in my pre-teen years, that I started to work part-time, a milk round, working on the market stalls, anything to earn a few quid. I was starting to fill out a bit and took an interest in music, fashion, and even grew my hair out. Glam rock was all the rage. I remember the first album I bought was Electric Warrior by T-Rex. They were big at the time, the year was 1972, and they held the #1 spot in the charts. The album cost me 2 quid, which was a whole day's money from working. I brought it from a record shop that I'd pass whenever I was walking to or from my nan's house down Old Jamaica Ard. David Bowie, T-Rex, Slade, and their songs were topics of conversation. I remember the girls at school would lean against the wall, listening to the popular groups and songs on their transistor radios during lunch break. One thing that impressed and attracted the girls was boys who were into music, fashion, and knew what was in. When I hit 13, I was on a mission, and much like a dog in heat, it was the start of my interest in the opposite sex. I was full-on girls, and trying to navigate how and what it took to get around them as much as possible was not only a daily conversation, but also an objective. This then led to making sure we went to as many birthday parties at people's houses as possible, and that there were girls there, and no sooner had the parents decided to disappear for a couple of hours, entrusting the group of young partygoers with a bit of responsibility, we'd be sneaking in the bottles of gin, cider and cans of lager. Our thinking was, this would improve our chances with the girls, but the only guarantee, of course, was us suffering the next day or two from the drinking. There were a few times of fumbling and stumbling about, until finally you'd landed a girl that was interested in you, as much as you were learning of the female anatomy, and the all-too-common lines and promises of, it's okay and you'd never tell anyone. It was also during these years that I experienced bullying from the much older kids at the school. We'd be on the coaches, going to play other schools for a football match, and there would be kids from either the 4th or 5th year walking through the coach and beating the younger kids up. For me, it was probably where I'd come into my own, filling out and having a broad set of shoulders that made them feel I needed to be knocked down a peg or two. But what bothered me as much as taking shit from older kids was the bullies' belief they could simply make anybody's day miserable because they didn't like the look of them, was not strong, or able to defend themselves. I always fucking hated that, and the way they acted. So one day I'd had enough, found myself standing up not just for some of the kids being systematically bullied, but also myself, and had it out with one of them. Back then, when you had a fight with someone, you'd meet them out of the teacher's sight, and not right in the middle of the school grounds. You did this for obvious reasons. You'd want to avoid the chance of being caught and the punishment of being caned. So, after school, you'd more often than not meet behind the school bike sheds, where all of the other boys would form a circle around you and whoever you were fighting. The routine was very much the same each and every time. It'd start with the accusations and reasons for the fight, some name-calling and the encouragement from your mates in the circle that had formed around you both. The next part was where things made, break or determined what happened next. The physical contact. More often than not, it consisted of a series of pushes, pokes in the chest, and getting in the other boy's face. And from there, consisted of a series of windmill punches and wrestling to the ground. But here, like a few times before, I was the smaller and younger of the two in the confrontation. I ended up on the floor. But as quickly as I went down, I jumped straight back up and shouted, "Is that it?" I'd had enough of the bully and the fact I simply didn't respect them, so no amount of punches, kicks, and being thrown to the ground was going to change that. I think it got to a stage where I learned I wasn't made of glass, or going to be held to ransom by anyone at school, so I started to get some back at the older boys. Then on one occasion, Jimmy Colkit got hold of one bully who'd given me a kicking before, pulled him to one side and gave him a good slap in front of me. Not long after that, though, Jimmy, who was a few years older than me, left the school. I felt like my safety net and backup had left me to now sort things out for myself. Being that our school was not known or had a history for fighting men, I decided that I'd better step up my game. With each attempt of someone trying to bully me, or another to suffer at the hands of a bully, I'd row with any kid of any age. And it wasn't long after that I become someone that wouldn't tolerate it, and was recognised as the main fighter in my year. From here on, I found my own place, and standing in the school, and never suffered a bad day because of the cowardice actions of a bully. One fight and caning I remember in particular was when a kid thought it was okay to go around and simply bash the other kids, so I took it upon myself to put him in his place. For the sake of the story, we'll call him George. I was standing inside the school gates, and much like most days, thinking about girls, football, and having both within my daily activities, when in walks George, but instead of acting like a decent human being and someone of a stable mind, he decided it'd be okay to simply walk up to some innocent, unsuspecting kid and lay into him. Punching, kicking, and being the cunt that he was, and probably still is. The unprovoked attack, that if witnessed and much like previous times, was something this evil prick enjoyed doing. They say that if society aligned with an eye for an eye will make the whole world blind. Well, tell that to someone who's now been forced to suffer a miserable existence at the hands of a bullying cunt who'll never make a conscientious decision in being a decent human being. Before I could get to him, George had left the poor kid on the floor and carried on inside the school, all without any thought or care of what level of injury, either physically or mentally, that he'd left the kid in. I eventually caught up with George, watching him enter his classroom, and waited for him to take his seat at his wooden desk. As I looked through the classroom door window, I saw him sitting there, with a grin and level of arrogance I was looking forward to wiping off his face, and it was only when the teacher had started the lesson for that class that I threw open the door and addressed George by calling him out and going at him without any mercy or reservation. I was going to smash this fucking arsehole into the ground and make him understand, not only how much he'd fucked up, but how much I detested people like him. I used both my hands, feet, and even the same wooden desk he was originally sitting at, and put him on his arse, and I made sure he stayed there. Once I was happy he'd learned his lesson, excuse the pun, I left the class only to be chased by a bunch of teachers that had heard all the commotion. It goes without question that the headmaster wasn't happy, and when asked, I admitted, not that there was any dispute on what and who had committed this act of violence, and justified my actions because of George's bullying ways that I wasn't going to tolerate. But rules are rules, and being that I've always been one that has respected the institute of schooling, teachers, and those that invest in a child's life, I accepted that I'd done something, that in my mind was the right thing, just in the wrong place. So after a few painful strikes of the cane, I left the room, clinching my arse cheeks together and telling myself, don't show it, don't show how much it fucking hurt. But I was all the more happier that another cowardly prick had met a level of justified punishment. Then it was as if there was a new dawn and age that had come. I was welcome to hang out with the older kids at the school. Certain privileges come with a status and friendship with an older crowd, the main one being girls that had developed and were more experienced in the ways of the world. Part of my later days of school life, and thankfully a time that I'd found my feet, was as much about music, girls, fashion, and fighting. School rivalries was commonplace, and there were a few close to us, so it was inevitable that we'd have a big row with them, but one main element that distinguished us from a lot of them. They had twice as many boys as us, and never had the prerequisite of being of a certain academic grade to come to the school. So, while other schools had little or no requirements to be allowed to attend, ours and more importantly our ranks weren't fitted out with seasoned fighters. And it was here I was introduced to what was all too common in most schools around the country, how exaggeration and childhood myths are commonplace. When word spread through the school that a mob of hundreds, docker-sized men were coming from Forest Gate High, it was like we'd been called to war. A few things went in our favour though, one being I'd gained a lot of confidence and would happily fight with any school, and in recent years our school had switched from a grammar school, whose policy was once based on the academics and thickness of a child's glasses, to that of an open-door policy, so if your name was written on a piece of paper you was admitted to the student body, and I had a few pals from West Ham that were a bit handy when it came to a row, one in particular, Ronnie Pyle, a skinhead that could really have a tear-up, who also brought a few pals. When the time came round, what was supposed to be hundreds of docker-sized men was in fact about 50 teens of the same age, and what was supposed to be a full-on war, fight till the death, turned out to be a, come on then, and fuck off, I'll fight you here and now. It was more of a verbal row and a bit of a stalemate. It also might have been something to do with Ronnie, as he was well known around Forest Gate, and wasn't known to be anything but someone who would fight come rain or shine. The remainder of my school year was one of fucking, fighting, and becoming who I would be known for years to come. Whatever was going on at school, home, or in life, the fact remained that my hormones and body were in full swing and very much in need, and I felt that I had both a moral obligation and responsibility in feeding those desires. So in an attempt to spend more time around and improve my chances with the girls, I considered my options and weighed up what was on offer during the school day, and luckily, at the same time, we were given a choice between wood, metalwork, or the cookery class. For me, it was a no-brainer. Admittedly, there were a few girls in both the metal and woodwork class, but this was only if you were into girls that looked like they played the cello, wore chunky, thick knee-high socks, had thick-rimmed glasses and played rugby with the boys. But for me, I fancied and wanted to be around those that wouldn't necessarily beat me in an arm wrestle. So I convinced my mate Neville to join the cookery class with me. What was a welcome surprise, but being it was a seed planted some years before, thanks to my dad's efforts in teaching me how to take care of myself, I took to cooking and really enjoyed it. So much that I even got one of my O-levels in the class, placing second highest in the whole year, and you have to remember that half the school was girls. Another common trait the girls liked was the smartly dressed, stereotypical bad boy and the image they were willing to portray. So, when I could rustle a few quid together, it was stay-pressed trousers, Dr. Martin boots, and Ben Sherman shirts. Loafers then followed Dr. Martin's, but you had to have them fitted with Blakey's shoe protectors. They were a horseshoe-shaped piece of metal that would be fitted to the bottom of your shoe, helping to prolong the life and wearing of the sole. But we'd end up skidding down the street in hope of sending up sparks and making a noise. Your shoes had to always be shined to perfection, and you should be able to see your face in them if polished properly. My test was being able to see up a girl's skirt when I placed my shoe below them. I remember going to Grandita's Boys and Menswear, now called Base, and was a favourite of mine, a one-stop shop for everything that a lad wanted and needed, much like a department store found on Oxford Street or Regent Street, but instead of being in the centre of London, it was right on my doorstep, conveniently placed on Green Street. Whether it was my first bottle of Brute aftershave, with its trademark metal medallion tag, or my first Crombie jacket, if you had a few quid, that was the place to go, and after going in there, I looked the dog's bollocks. But the school didn't have either the same opinion or view of my newfound wardrobe, but further adding to my Jacko reputation, I would get sent home. In the mind of the school administration, this was a form of punishment, as by them sending me home, forcing me to change and then return to school was a lesson of inconvenience. But, in fact, as it proved, it actually encouraged me to preempt being kicked out for the day, as my family had now moved to East Ham, which meant it was a 20-minute car drive, or the bus to get home. This exclusion gave me more reason and opportunity in bunking off school and doing what I wanted, not to mention the climbing up the ladder of notoriety in a lot of pretty girls' eyes. Each and every opportunity I got, I was trying to get my leg over with a girl. Then, when I did land one, we were both at it like rabbits, and the world was coming to an end. And I'm not kidding. When I say any opportunity, I went as far in working out a schedule, learning the timings and days of whose parents would be out, and for the longest, and it didn't even matter if it was for just 30 minutes. Let's go around mine, quick, my parents aren't home. Or, It's Tuesday. Your mum and dad are out. We can get a bit in there. I was at it like my life depended on my efforts and time spent on the subject. Then, what was probably one of the most embarrassing of times was when we got caught whilst we were at it. My dad had come home early from work, and with that he came to my door checking what I was up to and shouting, "Carlton, why's this door locked? Open it now." I remember saying to my girlfriend, "Fuck, quick, it's my dad," then adding, "Get yourself sorted out." But I'd been sussed. My dad was no fool, and no sooner had we sorted ourselves out, and I unlocked the door, he was all over me, with, "Don't ever do that again in this house," and so on. Dad was old school, but no number of threats and advice were going to lure me away from the girls or the experience. I'd found a new hobby and was hooked. Girls. My dad never gave up on me, had all the confidence and faith in my abilities, as he still had plans for me and my apprenticeship to become a marine engineer, counting my O-levels, 14 of them, a planned-out career and future around the East London docks. I, on the other hand, was counting the days until I was free to do what I wanted and simply be Jack the lad. I wanted to relive my primary school days of freedom and not having a care in the world, but from the viewpoint of an overconfident teenager who thought he had it all figured out. So, the academics, that was once a large part of my successful childhood, had now been replaced by some of the vices that was there for an East London teenager: music, fashion, girls, and supporting West Ham Football Club. My first love was at 13. We honestly envisioned we'd be together forever. I saw it all laid out in front of me: marriage, kids, house, a job for life, the lot. A realization of my progression from my childhood to adulthood was when I got an 18-year-old girl pregnant. I was just 14, but as said earlier on in this book, things didn't go as we'd hoped.